Reading is just a habit you gotta form in all life. Books don't change people's sentences.
Reading good, solid, reformed, Puritan literature, reading especially the classics, that's had the biggest impact on my life.
Well, g'day and welcome to another episode of the Reformers Bookcast, a podcast hosted by Reformers Bookshop. My name is Tom Eglinton, the manager here at Reformers, and today we are joined by Dr William Edgar. Thanks for joining us, Dr Edgar.
No, it's a pleasure to be here.
Now, for those of our listeners who don't know of you, would you introduce yourself for us?
Okay. Let's see. I'm 78 years old. I just recently retired from 33 years at Westminster Seminary. And previous to that, I was in Aix-en-Provence. And previous to that, I was in Greenwich, Connecticut. So I've had three basic careers. I'm an amateur jazz pianist. I've taught apologetics most of my life. I have a wonderful wife, two amazing children, and then three grandchildren. So I don't know what else you want to know.
That's good. A very full life. So you've lived in America and in France?
Yes, I actually grew up in Paris, so spoke French before English.
Amazing.
And so it was natural for us to go back when this Reformed seminary opened up in Aix-en-Provence, and they needed a professor of apologetics who could speak French.
And is your wife French as well?
She speaks very well. She's not.
Okay.
But she spent a lot of time in Europe, Italy, Switzerland, and France. So we're both very much at home there.
Now, you've written several books. You've written Schaeffer on the Christian Life, Created and Creating, and you've got a new book coming out on jazz. And I'm sure there's some books I've missed. But so I thought we could cover some of those topics today.
Fine.
So to begin with, Schaeffer, I've read several of the Theologian on the Christian Life books, and I was pleased when I opened up Schaeffer on the Christian Life to find that you knew Schaeffer personally.
Yes, he led me to the Lord when I was about 19 years old. I wandered up to L'Abri, as many agnostics did, and met him and had long conversations with him, and he convinced me about the Christian faith. So, and we remained friends for the remainder of his life.
Mm.
So I knew him very well.
What was he like as a person?
Gracious, kind, brilliant, always interested in what you were doing rather than in touting himself.
Mm.
Obviously, if you asked him the right questions, he would give you all kinds of strong views on his favorite subjects. But what stood out to me was his kindness.
Okay. So, genuinely interested in other people and caring for them.
Yeah, that's right. That was a characteristic of L'Abri altogether. They were, we had hundreds of people up there from all kinds of different backgrounds, and Fran and Edith Schaeffer always showed an extraordinary interest in each one who came up, in their personalities, their backgrounds, their talents. So one felt very welcome there.
Mm. It's quite a rare trait, isn't it?
Well, I'm sorry to say it is, especially these days. In those days, I think it was a little more common, but nevertheless, combined with his extraordinary acumen and his sharp mind, it was a very rich combination, kindness and brilliance.
Mm. Now, on the brilliance front, Schaeffer's written volumes of works. Do you think he's still relevant today? The world's changed a lot since
That's
his
a very
time.
good question. Yeah, I do actually. I think some of the examples he uses are out of date, but his concerns are not out of date. And what I love about him was his enthusiastic for worldview thinking, his fresh outlook on all of life, and that I think lasts. Um, and there's something like 10 Labries in the world. One of them is right in Sydney. It's a non-residential Labrie, but I think that's a testimony to the ongoing actuality of his approach. Some of it looks pretty passé when you first encounter it. Like he did a film which was not a good film, I worked on it, so I can say that. He shows up in his climbing outfit, and on one scene there's a wire coming out of his trousers, and it just wasn't professional. So some of what he's done looks retro, but the content is not. The content's very strong and very up to date.
It was at the film. Sorry, the film. How should we then live?
That's right.
Yeah, which was going off his book. Which one came first, actually? The film or the book?
No, the book came first. You're
Okay,
right.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe before we get to the culture element, which sort of feeds in through how should we then live, if someone were new to Schaeffer, and had never heard of him before or hadn't read him before, where would you recommend that they start?
I would say probably the three early introductory books. How Shall We Then Live? The God Who Is There, and maybe Escape from Reason,
Okay.
which was a kind of riff off of Doyeweerd's historiography, and a couple of other books too, like Death in the City, Pollution and the Death of Man. Those are good places to be introduced to him.
Now, is there some aspect of his thinking that you find particularly unique?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think his excitement about applying the gospel to all of life.
Right.
Many scholars part company with him on some of the details, and that's fair enough. But he had this extraordinary enthusiasm about applying the gospel to every part of life, the arts, business, and of course, central things like evangelistic concerns. So that's what I think endures. Another less tangible aspect is the life at L'Abri in Switzerland, which was the first branch of the Christian community which he founded. There was a great deal of prayer. We worked in the morning and studied in the afternoon, long meals with great conversations, seminars at night. It was a unique experience. Some people have called it a retreat. He didn't like that word, but it was sort of a place to get away and live in community. Before community and communes were kind of popular in the 60s.
Right. So it was after your experience at L'Abri then, and sort of encountering this intense dialogue and personal interaction, has that shaped how you've lived your life, and how?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I have enthusiastic views about applying the gospel to all of life. That has stayed with me. My prayer life is not as good as it should be, but it's an inspiration to think back to how we used to pray intensely. And my views of the church include his suggestions and occasionally his admonitions about the church and its life. The other thing is when I actually communicate the gospel to unbelievers, his approach, his conversations are ringing in my ears. And I think he had a unique way of finding the question behind the question and helping anyone, whosoever, identify places of need and emptiness and hunger. And at my best, I do that. I'm not as good as he was, um, and I certainly don't want to try to imitate him the way some people tried to imitate him, including his clothing style and his expression. That is not healthy.
No one, you don't wear knickerbockers?
I don't wear knickerbockers, and I don't have askets, which was he liked askets better than neckties.
Yes.
And he, it was embarrassing. Some students came away because of his power and his influence, using expressions that just weren't natural.
Yeah.
How long will man swear up and down God's universe? Well, we just don't talk like that. It was natural for him, but you got to develop your own way of doing things.
Yeah, that's helpful. And you've got some interesting examples in Schaeffer on the Christian Life where you illustrate his approach, which I found quite helpful.
Good.
One last question on Schaeffer. What was his training like? And how did he come to sort of have this grasp on the interaction of Christianity and life?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. It was eclectic. He did go to seminary. He spent a year at Westminster and then finished his work at an alternative seminary in Wilmington, Delaware. He was widely read, visited museums all the time, but if you're a PhD in a particular discipline, you're likely to be disappointed with his approach and his views on certain things. He might have been right, but at the same time, it was so informal and shooting from the hip that you might have been disappointed. And he will have claimed that his training was in practice through conversations with hundreds of people. He was kind of proud of the fact that he didn't go through the standard academic training. So that he had an eclectic background.
I find it interesting that I think you mentioned he just read copious amounts of things, different articles and books, and had an interest in life in general and in thought. What's your reading habits been like throughout your life? How have you found reading?
I'm one of those dreadful people who are trained in academics, and I read lots and lots and lots in different fields. But the difference between me and Schaeffer is that he would read books and articles that people would send him. And I don't do that. I mean, of course, if I see a great review, I'll pick the book up. But my reading habits are definitely more academic.
Right. Yeah. Now, Schaeffer wasn't the only interesting person you were acquainted with, because when you moved to Westminster and started studying there, you trained under Cornelius Van Til.
I met and encountered many interesting people in my life, beginning with my childhood, and they're all precious and important. And you're quite right. Now, I went to Westminster in the 60s as a theological student, and I took every course that Van Til taught and was greatly influenced by him and got to know him as a person. And when I came back to teach here, he was gone.
Right.
Yet his imprint is all over the place. So, yeah, I've met a good many interesting people. I've had a great privilege there.
Now, I haven't had the chance to read much Van Til or any. Should I? What should I read? Why should I read him? What was interesting about Van Til?
Well, a couple of things to say. I think his writings are very important. Probably his most fundamental book is called The Defense of the Faith.
Right.
My favorite little book of his is called My Credo, which is where he explains his upbringing and his faith in the Heidelberg Catechism. But he's also written a good deal on other subjects. One of his major concerns was the critique of Barth and Barthian thinking. I'd have to add, which I've said in print, that he's a tough go. Because he wasn't a natural writer, and many of his books came out of class notes.
Okay.
And B, because he was polemical in a way that many people today don't appreciate.
What do you mean by that?
You know, he would make a point and then say, here's how Roman Catholics do it, here's how Arminians do it, and so forth. And a lot of my students, until they began to see that what he was doing, just didn't appreciate that. It sounded to them like he was shooting down a lot of good people without giving them credit. I don't think he was doing that, but that's the way sometimes it comes across. So I would read Defense of the Faith, Common Grace and the Gospel, and then when you're much more advanced, start reading his stuff on Barth, which is very polemical.
Okay. That's helpful, thank you.
Yep.
Now, you're an apologist. Schaeffer, I guess, had an apologetic bent. And Van Til, I've often heard his name, Van Tilian apologetics. They seem to go together. What is apologetics, and what would be your approach to it?
Oh my! Well,
just a small one.
Yeah, a succinct definition would be: it's the defense and commendation of the Christian faith. Apologetics, as you probably know, it's a legal word, goes back into Greek culture, and it means something like setting one up for defense, getting one off of a charge. So you can think of Plato, his defense of Socrates. That's apologetics. So it's had a long history and has gone through many different phases. And I think today we're in a fairly exciting phase where we're moving into cultural and sociological areas without giving up the basic philosophy that's behind apologetics. In the medieval times, it was so tied to philosophy that it was a discipline that appropriated people like Aristotle and others and tried to Christianize them. And there was some usefulness to that, but it would be pretty ineffective today, except with a very narrow group of people.
So you said that it's apologetics is moving into this stage of engaging with sociological and cultural issues. What does that look like? What do you mean by that?
Well, a lot of credit goes to Os Guinness, whom you may have heard of.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
He, after his time at L'Abri, went to Oxford to do his doctorate, and he studied under several people that were concerned to set ideas in their social context. And his doctoral dissertation was on Peter Berger, who was probably the outstanding sociologist of religion in the 20th century. And his thesis was that Berger's sociology was highly applicable to the task of apologetics. So to give you an idea, just one of Berger's insights was to see the relation between ideas and institutions. He was not a Marxist, because Marx reduced ideas to institutions, but he had in common with Marx a concern to relate ideas to institutions. Just a quick example, if you look at the city of Paris, there's the right bank and the left bank. And the right bank is where all the fashion stores are, the businesses, the movies. The left bank is where all the murky cafes are and bookstores and so on. And Guinness makes the point that Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism would never have been born in the right bank, but it was born in a natural way in the left bank. In fact, it was literally born in a back room in a couple of the cafes. And Guinness says, unless we take into account what he calls structures of plausibility, our apologetics will be empty. It will be an in-house language for just a rarefied group of people, but it won't convince, it won't persuade.
So what you're saying, I think, let me just sort of play it back to you to see if I'm getting you right.
Sure.
You're saying that each individual sees the world in a particular way, and you have to be conscious of that in order to communicate effectively to that person.
Yeah, that's good. In other words, if you try to preach the gospel in a medieval way, you can give airtight reasons why Aristotle's 5 proofs lead to a first cause, an unmoved mover, and so forth. But it won't persuade very many people. First of all, God's not an unmoved mover. He's the creator God of the Bible. But more importantly, those proofs are wonderful, rational formulas which almost no one thinks in terms of unless they're a professional philosopher. Whereas if you help people to see that Christianity comes out, or philosophy for that matter, worldviews, both positive and negative, come out of social and historical situations, to be really simplistic, secularization or pluralism or whatever, then you're likely to get people's attention. And the church becomes very important. It's the premier structure of plausibility that the Bible gives us, that Jesus gives us. And so, for example, one of the reasons that people like, I don't know, Tim Keller have been so effective is because his message has been, it's a great message, but it's been church-based, community-based, involved with people who are out there in the city trying to figure life out and so forth. And that's, I think, in addition to sound arguments, which you need, sensitivity to context is all important. And, you know, missiologists have known this for a long time, and have practiced it on the mission field. But sometimes the ordinary Christian who comes from an evangelical background hasn't been as aware of that, and is sort of steeped in the older arguments, maybe not Aristotle, but evidential thinking and so on.
So would that essentially mean that as an everyday Christian, in order to engage with my neighbours, I should probably read a few things on today's culture and where people are coming from, potentially even from a Christian perspective? Like here's someone who's gone and grappled with society and then and shown you how the Christian faith relates to that.
It does mean that.
Okay.
I think if you don't read about context and history, you're going to sound like you're from another planet, and you just won't be heard.
Yeah, that's helpful. And then that's interesting too, from a sort of preaching perspective. You mentioned Tim Keller. Like, if it seems to me by what you're saying, if the church is always talking in its own language and its own isolated context and not engaging with the world from the pulpit even, then you're going to end up with a group of Christians at that church who don't know how to talk to their neighbor about Christianity because it's so divorced from society.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Dick Kais calls it tribalism. People operate in their tribes, and evangelical Christians, I don't know about Australia, but in North America, some of them don't realize there's a larger world out there, and they're not able to interact with the challenges of that larger world because they've been living in their own tribe. They're comfortable with their language, their hymns, their traditions, homeschooling, all the rest of it. So, it's not a call to go out and, be a worker priest or anything like that, but we have to understand the times. I read a lot of history and some sociology and culture studies because I am interested, but also in order to understand where we are in our times. Just a brief example, we all remember how joyful 1989 was when communism fell in many parts of the world. Only 10 or 15 years later, the joy was gone. And why? And I think there are good historical reasons for that. The conflicts in the Balkans, the failure of rebels to overcome the Chinese hegemony and symbolized by Tiananmen Square, and the cultural forces of indifference and secularization, so that, unless we understand that we're not living in 1989, which was very exciting, we're going to be ineffective.
Yeah, that's
Francis Fukuyama. I don't know if you're familiar with Francis Fukuyama. He's a very bright Japanese historian. who said in 1989 this was the end of history. Now, he didn't mean no more events would occur, but he said this is people have come to democracy. There's no more real work to be done. Well, he was massively wrong.
Yes.
I mean, just to take the rise of Islam, that's not the end of history. So I think Christians need to work on these issues and be conversant with them in order to persuade our generation.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Now, we've been edging our way towards culture, and which is where you have written, created and creating, and I think your new book on jazz will connect to this whole thing a little bit. Can you, I guess, begin by explaining why Christians, or maybe we should start with what is culture? Let's start there.
Oh, this is a simple question. Culture is, it goes back to Genesis 1, where God called human beings literally to cultivate. There was an agrarian side, but there was a metaphorical side, which is to take the world as they encountered it and process it, understand it, or as Genesis puts it, to have dominion over it. Now, there's a long history to what happened to culture since then, but people are still in the process of cultivating the world around them. So culture is cultivation. And it's the air we breathe, it's the tasks we're given. And a lot of people don't realize they're engaging in culture, whether they like it or not. So, but there's lots of great definitions of culture. And in my book that you mentioned, Created and Creating, I review some of those.
So, so culture then is the way that man has dominion over the world and the result of that.
Yeah.
Yep.
There are three things in the calling, which I think have stayed intact and are actually etymologically related to the word culture. First is cultivation and having loving, gentle dominion over the world. The second, oddly, is colonization.
Huh.
Now, that's a bad word in a lot of places, but it means going out, sharing the wealth of your gifts with the gifts of other people that you encounter. When Paul said, God has made from one all people and he set them in their territory to grope after him, if haply they should find him. That's colonization. And then the third is cult worship. I think culture has to be related to what you worship. And there's a lot of insights into that with some of the younger philosophers today. So cultivation, colonization, and cult still belong to our cultural endeavors.
And I guess that sort of highlights that we're always going to be creating culture, like you said. We're always going to be doing something, sharing something, and worshipping something. And that clearly Christians should do those things differently to non-Christians.
Yep, very well put. Yep.
So then, how do you work with? We're Christians in this world. There is a culture that is shifting and moving in a particular direction, and then as Christians, we want to engage with that culture, but we also want to be creating we want to be doing culture in a slightly different way, or maybe a radically different way. How do we deal with this tension of living in and, I guess, engaging in culture as a Christian as well?
Yeah, well, if you had 3 weeks, I could give you some ideas.
Give me a little
But
taste.
no, I know. How do we do it is no different in one way from how you live the Christian life as reflected in the New Testament teaching of being salt and light, treating your servants well, raising your children well, worshiping God aright, working and not relying on, society for your income, and just all of those things. And what is the fruit of culture should be gathered to God's glory. There's a wonderful passage in the book of Revelation. It says, "Kings come marching into the New Jerusalem
Yeah.
with the glory of the nations." Well, what is that glory? Well, it's treasure. It's using old language of booty, and that's where we ought to be. We ought to be creating, as you suggested, alternative cultures to challenge the world, whose culture is often alien to the principles of the gospel. So I don't think we should engage in violent culture wars where there's white hats and black hats, because I think that those make the two sides too much of a military conflict. But I do think we should identify the places in society where the gospel is needed, and live as salt and light, or as one recent author suggested, live as priests in the culture, bringing what is discovered to the feet of the cross. Those are very abstract ways of putting our daily tasks, but I think that's what we need to be doing.
Yeah, I like that. So essentially you're saying that the Christian life is one where your hands get dirty. You should work as a Christian. You should marry as a Christian, and that will, as you do those things, as you raise your kids as a Christian in the changing of nappies and feeding of mouths and these sorts of things, you will, if you're purposeful about that and worshipful about that, you will create something of a Christian culture around you.
That's really well put. You should write your own book.
No, I don't think that's going to happen. No, that's really helpful. And then I love that passage in Revelation. The way I read that was that I preached on it recently, and I encouraged people to think about their work and their art and all of these things as it. When we create culture that is most glorifying to God, something of that will translate into the new heavens and new earth.
That's right.
Would that be
whatever
too strong?
that something is?
Yes.
People ask, "What's the music going to be like in heaven?" I wish I knew. It might be Bach cantatas, or it might be African dance music, or it might be something completely fresh and new. But to put it your way, there is something of a continuity between what we do and what we will be in the new heavens and new earth. Unlike some theologies that say it's all going to be destroyed.
Yeah.
Why bother? Don't polish the brass on the Titanic. So, yeah, there's a continuity, and it just means that what we do, whether we eat or drink, do it all to the glory of God, and there'll be some lasting fruit to that, whatever it is going to look like.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And now, just lastly, you've got a new book coming out very soon. It may have just
It's already out.
Just released.
It just came out last week.
There you go. Takes a while to come to Australia, so.
Yeah.
But it's on jazz. And I find this interesting because, and this relates back to Schaeffer where we started. I think, at least in my upbringing, my understanding of Reformed Christianity, the idea of beauty has been lost a little bit. And so what role do the arts play in the Christian life? Is there a biblical basis for that, for art being something that's valuable and of interest to Christians?
We need another 3 weeks for that one. But
I like big questions.
Yeah, you do. It's good. It's important questions. Well, to start with the obvious, the arts are a great gift. They're not an option. They're a gift. And all of us should have an aesthetic sense. Not all of us should be professional artists. But the environment that God has placed us in does need to be beautified. And I think jazz music at its best does that. Zora Neale Hurston, who was a marvelous black author of the 20th century, called it finding beauty in the ashes. Because black people who produced this art suffered so much. But in the ashes, there was beauty, if you know where to find it. So, the arts have a huge place to play. And Reformed people have been slow, but not completely silent on this. When I was at L'Abri, there was a chap named Hans Rockmacher who had written extensively on visual art and on jazz, of all things. So he was a Dutch art historian. I don't completely agree with all of his views, but he had the great virtue of bringing to our attention the role of the arts, the atmosphere that we live in. And some of it was very basic, what kind of pictures do you have hanging in your living room? When you go to an art museum, what do you see? And some of it was much more abstract, like how do you order your life in an aesthetic fashion by encouraging artists, practicing various arts and so on. So, he was Reformed. There's been plenty of developments since, perhaps in a more disciplined, rigorous way. I think my favorite philosopher of art is Calvin Seerveld, who for years taught in Toronto at the Institute for Christian Studies. And he's written extensively on the way the arts shapes our thinking, how to encourage painters, just lots and lots of writing. And he's still with us. He's 90-something. And I think people like that, think of Mako Fujimura, who is an abstract expressionist, who's a wonderful Reformed Christian. I mean, things are happening. It's very slow. And a lot of Christians still have the idea, well, it's a luxury, or it's a waste of time, or it's something that you do when in your leisure time. And I think that needs to be combated very strongly.
Do you have an introductory book that you would generally sort of give to someone if they're wanting to understand the role of art in the Christian life?
Wow, let's see. That's a really good question. I guess probably Calvin Seerveld's, try to get the title right, Bringing Fresh Olive Branches.
Okay.
These Dutch guys always had fun titles. That's probably the one that I would give first to just awaken people to the role of the arts. And he has a whole section on beauty in there. And He's got lots of other books. They did a festschrift in his honor. It had also the fascinating title of something like Pledges of Jubilee. But it's a really good book with all kinds of suggestions on the arts. And then one of his first books, now what was it called? It was a simpler title. It had to do with introducing all kinds of dimensions of art to ordinary life. It was something like Art in a Fallen World or something. The word fallen was in there.
Okay.
I'm getting older, so I'm forgetting these things.
That's all right. That's very helpful. I'll hunt down those two
Yeah,
books,
do
I
that.
reckon.
Yeah.
Calvin Seerveld.
Yeah, Serveld.
Okay.
He grew up. His father was a fishmonger in Long Island, and this kid has a deep respect for people who work with their hands and so on. But he went on to be a brilliant scholar, and then to teach at the Toronto Institute.
Well, last question for you, Dr. Edgar. It's been a fascinating
Sure.
discussion. I feel like we could chat for hours, but what do you like about jazz?
Oh my, another 3 weeks coming up.
Why do you like jazz?
Why do I like it?
I mean, to the untrained ear, it sounds like chaos, right? I like jazz. I played in a jazz band in high school, but what is it that you like about jazz?
Well, the thesis of my book is that in musical form, it expresses deep sorrow moving towards inextinguishable joy. And that goes for all kinds of expressions of jazz, from New Orleans to the best of swing to bebop. And jazz, because of this narrative, has a certain spontaneous creativity to it, which is just a great joy to listen to. I don't know what else to say.
No, that's
You remember
sorry, go on.
Nietzsche said something like, if there were no music, life would be a mistake.
Nietzsche said
Well, I
that.
think Nietzsche said, I know, he says the thing right. I like to say, if there were no jazz, life would be a monumental error. And you'll just have to read the book to see how I defend its propriety.
You've sold me there, and that actually makes sense given how you see the music of jazz. To a statement I heard you make in an interview where you said that you do gospel presentations mixed with jazz.
Yeah.
To illustrate as you go.
Yeah, I used to be in a trio that traveled quite widely, and our vocalist was an extraordinary gospel singer, jazz singer, and we would go through the history of African American people and how they produced this music, and give examples of the music to people who often had no idea of what jazz was. Perhaps among the most moving experiences we had was going to Eastern Europe, and people in the audience literally started weeping when we played the blues, because they had suffered so much under communism. They identified perfectly with the slaves that produced the blues. So yeah, I'm too old to do that now, and my legs don't work, but I did that a lot of my life, and it's one of the joys of what the Lord has allowed us to do.
Well, Dr. Edgar, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for your time. And congratulations on your recent retirement. And I hope and pray the Lord gives you many more years of enjoyment of his good creation and fruitful labours as well in whatever it is that he has planned for you.
Thank you, brother. That means a lot. Okay.
And you've been listening to the Reformers Bookcast, and you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time.